In the summer of 1941, the rules of war on the Eastern Front were changing. German tank units were advancing rapidly, but Soviet tanks of a size and weight they had never seen before were beginning to appear in their path. The battlefield was changing. It was no longer just well-trained crews and tactics that mattered. Armor thickness mattered, gun power mattered, and so did the punishment a tank could withstand. So, how far could the Panzer III go in this new kind of war? Thicker armor, more powerful guns, a heavier tank. The Panzer III was now forced to fight more than enemy tanks. It also had to fight the changing conditions of war itself. But could it survive that struggle? The answer lies in its design. It lies in its first major tests on the battlefield, and it lies in the transformation it underwent throughout the war. Now, let's go back to the very beginning of the Panzer III's story. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, Germany's armored forces were not yet the large tank formations we know today. At the time, the Panzer III was designed as a tank for the future of Germany's armored forces. Its role was clear: to fight enemy tanks. But that was not the only thing that made it interesting. The Panzer III was a design that had to keep changing as the war progressed. Its armor was thickened, its gun was enlarged, its suspension was changed, its weight increased. Yet despite all these improvements, there came a point when it could no longer carry more powerful weapons. That tension was at the heart of the Panzer III's story. The initial requirements were established on January 11, 1934. They called for a vehicle weighing around 24 tons. Its top speed was expected to be about 35 kilometers per hour. The basic idea was for the Panzer III and Panzer IV to operate together. The Panzer III would focus on tank warfare. The Panzer IV was intended to engage infantry and anti-tank positions. But even at the design stage, there was an important problem. Some within the German army wanted the tank to use a 37mm gun. The reason was not simply that it was considered sufficient at the time. The gun could use the same ammunition as the infantry's 37mm PaK-36 anti-tank gun. That would make logistics easier. At the same time, it was thought that a more powerful 50mm gun might be needed in the future. The solution was to design the Panzer III's turret ring wide enough to accept a 50mm weapon. It may have seemed like a small decision, but as the war progressed, it would become one of the most important engineering decisions in extending the tank's service life. The hull of the Panzer III was a typical example of German tank design thinking before the war. Different suspension solutions had been tested on the early A, B, C, and D models. The real turning point came with the Ausf. The earlier leaf spring arrangement was replaced by torsion bar suspension. The layout with 6 large road wheels on each side also became standard. This configuration formed the basic mechanical architecture of the later Panzer III models. This change did not simply mean a more modern suspension. Because the torsion bars were placed in the bottom of the hull, a careful engineering balance was needed between interior space and the mechanical layout. At the same time, the 6 large road wheels distributed the tank's weight more evenly along the tracks. They also provided a solid foundation for cross-country mobility. The gradual reduction of mechanical problems in later Panzer III variants allowed this chassis to remain in use for a long time. On the armor side, the development of the Panzer III could be seen much more clearly. The early models from A to C used armor in the approximately 15mm class. It quickly became clear that this was insufficient. The D, E, F, and G models therefore moved to an armor level of about 30mm. On the Ausf. H, an additional 30mm plate was added to the front section. With the Ausf. J, the frontal armor of the hull and turret reached 50mm. On the later L, M, and N models, additional 20mm spaced armor plates were applied to the front. So between the early Panzer III and the Panzer III of the later war period, there was not merely a difference of a few small details, there was a major transformation. However, thicker armor came at a price. As the tank progressed from the early vehicles to the later models, its weight increased from approximately 15.4 tons to 23 tons. Engine power also had to compensate for this weight. The models from the early A through D used the 250 horsepower Maybach HL108. Later models standardized the 300 horsepower 12-cylinder Maybach HL120 family. Despite this, the top speed could be kept at around 40 kilometers per hour. Fuel capacity also increased according to the production period. It went from 300 to 310 and later 320 liters. Road range was about 165 kilometers on the early models. On the heavier later vehicles, it fell to about 155 kilometers. Cross-country range was approximately 95 kilometers. The Panzer III's mobility was not simply a matter of engine power. The Variarex pre-selective transmission used on early Ausf vehicles was a complex system. It was intended to reduce the physical workload on the driver. But this complexity also brought reliability problems at first. Unit reports from 1939 recorded repeated failures involving the transmission, steering, brakes, drive shafts, and running gear. On later H, J, L, M, and N models, the Variarex was replaced by different solutions. A significant portion of the early production problems was corrected. For this reason, it is not correct to evaluate the Panzer III's mechanical reliability with a single figure. Operating conditions mattered. So did maintenance, air filter condition, lubrication, and the availability of spare parts. The durability of the engine also depended on wartime conditions. A report from the Eastern Front in 1941 stated that the engines in a mixed tank fleet reached an average of 1,100 to 1,500 kilometers after approximately 4 weeks of continuous operations. Dust was an important cause of engine wear, especially when air filter maintenance was inadequate. The interior layout of the Panzer III was one of the strongest aspects of its design. The 5-man crew consisted of the commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator. The 3-man turret meant that the commander did not have to perform another task at the same time. This small detail made a major difference on the battlefield. The commander could search for targets and assess the situation. The gunner operated the gun. The loader prepared the ammunition. The driver moved the vehicle, and the radio operator handled communications. The problem of having multiple duties concentrated on a single crew member, as seen in some rival tanks, did not exist here. Armament was the central issue that defined the entire career of the Panzer III. From the A through the early G models, it used the 3.7 cm KWK 36L/45. During the campaigns of 1939 and 1940, this gun was sufficient against certain targets. But in France, the Panzer III encountered more heavily armored vehicles. These included the Saumur S-35 and especially the Char B-1 BIS. Its crews had to reach the enemy's weaker side or rear. This experience accelerated the need for a more powerful gun. That was why the 5 cm KWK 38L/42 was introduced. With standard armor-piercing ammunition, this gun could penetrate approximately 47 millimeters of armor at a distance of 500 meters. That was a significant improvement over the earlier 37mm gun. However, the new gun occupied more space. It also reduced ammunition capacity from approximately 120 rounds to 87 rounds. Stronger torsion bars and wider tracks were used to compensate for the weight of the more powerful weapon. Changing the gun was not simply a matter of replacing the barrel, it created an engineering chain that affected other parts of the tank as well. When Barbarossa began in 1941, the Panzer III was one of the most important tanks on the German front line. But the appearance of the Soviet T-34 and KV series revealed the basic limits of the design. The Panzer III's short 50mm gun could be inadequate against the armor of these new tanks. In response, the longer 5 cm KWK 39L/60 was developed. It was used on later production AOSF-J vehicles and on the L models. At suitable ranges, this This gun posed a much more serious threat to the T-34's frontal armor. However, the tank's turret ring and interior space limited the Panzer III's ability to move to a larger gun. The problem was no longer simply the power of the gun. The tank's basic architecture no longer allowed it to grow any further. Protection also continued to be developed during this period. On some models, additional 20mm spaced plates were added over the 50mm frontal armor. From 1943 onward, side armor skirts known as Schürzen were also used. These plates were intended especially to protect the sides of the hull and turret. In this way, the Panzer III managed to extend its service life in a war where more powerful enemy anti-tank weapons were appearing. But every additional layer of armor increased the vehicle's weight. It also placed more load on the mobility system. The final major transformation of the Panzer III came with the Ausf. From 1942 onward, some vehicles were fitted with the short-barreled 7.5cm KWK 37L/24 gun. This gun had previously been used on early models of the Panzer IV. In this way, the Panzer III moved away from its original role. It returned to an infantry and close support role. A total of 614 Ausf. Vehicles were produced or converted during the 1942 and 1943 production periods. These vehicles were particularly useful against infantry and small fortified targets. When operating alongside Tiger heavy tanks, their roles became even clearer. The Tiger dealt with armored targets at longer ranges. The Panzer III suppressed the infantry threat at close range. Production of the Panzer III ended in August 1943. Over approximately 6.5 years, between 5,599 and 5,680 combat variants were produced. Comparing the first Ausf-A with the final Ausf-N, weight had increased from 15.4 tons to 23 tons. Armor thickness in the strongest areas had risen from approximately 16mm to 70mm, and the main gun caliber had increased from 37mm to 75mm. These figures actually summarize the entire story of the Panzer III. The same basic chassis was continuously made heavier and more heavily armed, in an effort to keep pace with the changing conditions of war. But the Panzer III's real legacy did not end with the end of production. Its durable chassis became the basis for various specialized vehicles, most notably the Sturmgeschütz III. For this reason, it is incomplete to judge the Panzer III's success only by how effectively it destroyed enemy tanks. It was a tank that carried the tactical and technical thinking of Germany's armored forces during the early years of the war. At the same time, it was a tank trying to adapt to the rapidly changing conditions of warfare. The story of the Panzer III was the story of how long a tank could keep pace with the changing face of war. Initially seen as the tank of the future, this vehicle eventually reached its own limits. The years passed. Armor became heavier, guns became more powerful, opponents became larger. But not every tank that leaves a mark on the battlefield is the most powerful one. Sometimes, the real story is where its strength began and where it ended. The Panzer III was left behind, but its steel continued to live on as part of the story of Germany's armored forces through the hardest years of the war. If you want to discover the real stories behind these steel machines, join us. Because the story of the next tank has yet to be told. We will continue discovering the stories behind the steel until we meet again in the story of the next tank. Goodbye.